Hey everyone, Jason here. So today's the day that I've really been looking forward to. The day that we lay out the fiberglass cloth on the deck of the Kayak. So before we get started, I should tell you that I have taken a few steps that you definitely should do when you build your own Shearwater. Now the first thing is I cleaned up the shop as best as I could, removing all the dust from just around the Kayak and the floor, everything from the fairing, the planing and the sanding that I did. So I also used a hand brush to brush off the deck of the Kayak, and then followed up with a tack cloth and just lightly dusted the Kayak to remove any dust. Now, what I did afterwards, is I just ran my hand along the surface just to see if there was any dust, and there isn't, so that's good. Okay, so the next thing is I'm just going to lay out the fiberglass cloth and get everything prepared. So let's get started. Having someone in your shop to help you spread the glass over the deck of the Kayak is ideal, but it's definitely something you can do on your own. Just take some care as you lay out the glass, start at one end, and slowly unroll the fiberglass across the deck. With the glass laid on the deck, the next step is to pull the fabric over so that we can save some of the material. Ideally, what we want is between 1 and 2 inches of overhang on both sides. When we apply the epoxy to the fiberglass, we'll be applying the epoxy to this overhang and it'll seal up the deck completely. Just like the fairing and sanding was so important to get a nice finish on the deck, so is laying out the cloth. I'm going to take my time and make sure that I have a nice fit with a good overhang on both sides. I'm going to smooth it out from end to end, trying to make sure that I don't have any major creases or bumps or anything that could get in the way of getting that nice perfect job at the end. So again, we're going to use a pair of sharp scissors to trim off the excess cloth. Despite being near completion, we're going to still take care to not get the fabric too dirty. We'll be able to use it later for other projects. We're going to mix up the mass system epoxy the same way as we've done throughout the whole building process. 1 pump of resin to 1 pump of hardener. Again, take a lot of care as you do your mixture. Make sure that the pre-calibrating pump is fully back to the ready position before you squeeze in any more epoxy into your mixing container. The cure time of the epoxy is going to vary depending on the temperature of your shop. For me, I'm going to do about 4 pumps of epoxy and resin for each mix. Most problems people have with epoxy is due to either it not calibrating properly or a bad mix. So I'm going to make sure that I mix my epoxy for a good 2 minutes each batch. The real secret to an epoxy clear coating is to control the thickness of each layer. Again, I'm going to use a trimmed brush and a squeegee to apply the epoxy. I'm going to start off by pouring small amounts of the epoxy onto the deck, and then I'll use my trimmed brush to press and brush in the epoxy into the fabric. I'm starting at one end of the deck, and I'm going to focus on doing one side and then the other as I work down the deck. What's important is that we try to maintain the same level thickness of epoxy across the entire deck, and that's when the squeegee will come in. Even though we're going to sand the epoxy later on, it's much easier to get a nice finish if we apply the epoxy in a nice level, even coat. The squeegees that you use for applying epoxy can be quite rigid. What you want to do is have your thumb underneath the squeegee and then form a bit of a flex in it so that the squeegee takes the contour of the surface of the deck. You want to angle your squeegee at about 45-degree angle. And don't press too hard, just enough to drag the epoxy smoothly down the hull. This is the first coat of epoxy, and the purpose of it is basically to glue down the fiberglass to the deck. We don't want too much epoxy. If we do, the fiberglass could float. So what we want to do is we want to apply a layer that saturates the cloth and still maintains that the cloth lays flat on the deck. And after using the squeegee, we want to almost see a weave of fabric. Later on, when the epoxy's cured, the fiberglass is going to feel somewhat coarse due to the weave of the fabric. That's okay, we'll add another coat of epoxy, and that will be the fill coat and make a nice, level, smooth surface. In the series, I haven't really discussed the safety concerns with epoxy, but I should mention that it's important that you have some good cross ventilation and make sure that you wear gloves. I also highly recommend that you don't smoke or eat during the process. You want to make sure that you reduce the exposure to toxic uncured epoxy while the epoxy reaches a full cure. Really, I can't overstate the importance of taking the appropriate safety precautions when working with epoxy and fiberglass. So again, I'm going to recommend that you check out the Mass System Epoxy website where you can find out exactly what they recommend when working with their products. As we continue to apply the epoxy and move our way up the deck, we get to the area in front of the cockpit. This area has a much higher angle and the epoxy will run off quite quickly. You may need to pour smaller amounts to prevent it from running down the sides of your boat. Other than that, the process remains the same. Pour a little epoxy, brush it on, and then squeegee it thin. Alright, so I just finished off with the first coat of epoxy, and I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to do the fill coat after I've built out the combing, and I'll do that in the next video. Alright, thanks for watching.